Good evening and welcome to our Bible study. Let's begin with prayer. Father, thank you for tonight, and I just pray that you would help me as we continue our look at the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and help us to understand more about those that we interact with regard to their faith so that we might be able to better, more effectively share our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So we left off last time kind of talking more about the doctrine or belief system of the Mormons, which develops out of three works. The first one, of course, we've already talked about the history of that a little bit, and that was the Book of Mormon and how we got the Book of Mormon from the supposed tablets that were found in the ground, and then later from the supposed stones that were found in the ground that came from the breastplate of Aaron and that enabled Joseph Smith to mystically translate the Book of Mormon. It all just sounds like a science fiction novel, but it's exactly what the Mormons teach and believe and still hold to. After the first publication of the Book of Mormon in Palmyra, they sold 5,000 copies in the initial printing of it, and they financed it at the price of $3,000, which was the mortgage taken out on Sidney Rigdon's home. He was such a believer in what Smith was doing that he put his money where his mouth is. So during that time, there was a local young man who was a teenager at that time, a Methodist, who had moved into the area near Palmyra with his young wife. He read the book shortly after publication and came and submitted himself to be baptized as a Mormon. That young man's name was Brigham Young. Now, Brigham Young will later become, in my opinion, a more important figure in Mormon history than even Joseph Smith himself. In fact, even Mormons will tell you that Brigham Young played more of a crucial role in kind of the formation of the Mormon Church into what it is today. He was far more of an organizer, I think, than Smith was, and so everything that you see in the modern Mormon Church really bears the fingerprints of Brigham Young. But Brigham Young was obviously a very early convert then to Mormonism. After the book was published, the first organizational meeting of the LDS was held at the Whitmer farm outside of Palmyra with about 50 people in attendance. Smith and Cowdery and two others were ordained as elders, and Smith adopted the title of prophet. The first four missionaries of the Mormon Church then headed west that October. Now, it's important to remember that as we start talking about the Mormon journey and how they traveled from where they were to eventually ending up settling in Salt Lake City, it's important to remember that this was in the early to mid 1800s. Okay, this particular time we're talking about right here. The conversion of Brigham Young was in the early 1830s. Okay, so this was during a time when the American frontier was not very far away. Okay, America had not been settled. Don't think in terms of the America that we know with major cities and industrialization and all that kind of stuff. This was pre-Wild Wild West. Okay, when you think of the Wild West, you think of Texas in 1880. Okay, this is 1831, so a full 50 years before the time that we refer to as the time of the era of the Wild West. So these areas that we're talking, like Illinois, Ohio, these were frontier settlements. They were way out in Indian territory. Okay, so this was very, very early years before the westward expansion really exploded, because the westward expansion really did not explode until the gold rush. So anyway, the missionaries began to spread west because they felt it was their destiny to take the message of Mormon to the Indians throughout the Indian territory. So their first burden was for the native peoples of America, okay? And the reason for that burden, obviously, is because I've told you the story of the Book of Mormon. It's all about the people who came from Israel to settle in what is today America, and they were the predecessors of, the ancestors of the American Indians. Okay, the native peoples of America are essentially descended from these Jews who made it over here on this boat from the Middle East and settled in upstate New York and then spread from there across the nation, okay? So obviously the early Mormons who believe this story and latch onto it, they believe it is their responsibility to go basically and tell the Indians what their heritage was, that they are the people who kind of started this whole ball rolling, if you will. So as they began to travel westward and spread the gospel, eventually a group of them ended up settling in Kirtland, Ohio, and there a minister a local Baptist minister decided to join the LDS group, and he brought his 100-member congregation with him. Soon afterwards, a vision instructed Smith to move the early Mormon community even further west from there. They were on the edge of Ohio to a place called Kirtland, Ohio. And to this day, if you travel to Kirtland, Ohio, you will find the original first Mormon temple there. Now, the Mormon Church has split 100 times since those days. There are so many different branches of the Mormon Church that, remember when we talked about Adventism and the Seventh-day Adventists, and I talked about all the fragments that they have divided into, various different groups that have spun out of the original Seventh-day Adventist group. Well, the Mormons are the same way. They have literally dozens of sects, and one of those sects considers themselves to be the original true Mormon Church, and they are still headquartered in Kirtland, Ohio, and they still use that temple that was first built there by the original Mormon settlers in that area as their temple. It's been, of course, it's been renovated and restored many times, and all that kind of stuff. But the basic structure of the building is still the same building that they built in the 1830s. While they were there, and after Joseph and his wife reached Kirtland, other church members began to join them in the spring. Over the next 6 years, Smith was based there, and during that time, he received 65 divine revelations pertaining to church structure and organization. It's during this time that he begins to write the book, Doctrines and Covenants. Now, that book will be far, far more important in terms of Mormon theology than the Book of Mormon, okay? It is an outgrowth of the story of the Book of Mormon, okay? It takes its cues from the history that Joseph Smith basically created for the Book of Mormon, but he takes the ideas or the concepts he presents there and begins to develop into doctrinal teaching. So it's during this time in Kirtland and during the writing of this magnum opus called Doctrine and Covenants that they will begin to develop more of a settled theology. After the missionaries spread from there to Missouri, they began to settle in a small frontier town called Independence, Missouri. Smith led a small group of Mormons from Kirtland to Independence, and according to the story, he believed that God had revealed to him that Independence, Missouri will be the gathering place for all Mormons and the site at which the New Jerusalem will descend from heaven. So in August of 1831, they began to lay the cornerstone for a temple there, and within a year, they had gathered more than 800 church members in the area. Smith kept the headquarters back in Kirtland as far as the publishing of the Book of Mormon, the publication of his new work, Doctrines and Covenants, which was in its first edition. There would be 13 editions during which he would add different revelations to it as the work went on. But so this group is growing. They're becoming quite large, and they built yet another temple there in Independence, and it became a very another one of the keystone kind of stepping stones of the Mormon denomination. And just like what happened in Kirtland, where they have the church, I think they call it the Body of Christ Church today. They have a different name than Mormon, but they still consider themselves Mormon. In the same way, there was a group that stayed in Independence, and they eventually satellited off from the main church, and they consider themselves to be the true Mormon church, okay? There can only be one true Mormon church, so obviously either the people in Ohio are wrong or the people in Missouri are wrong, but one of the two groups has to be wrong because both of them claim they're the true Mormon church. But the group in Independence is called the Reformed Latter-day Saints, RLDS. Now, of the various different sects or branches, today, RLDS is the largest of the sect groups. The mainstream LDS in Salt Lake City is the biggest, but the largest of the various splinters is the Reformed, or RLDS. And you say, well, what's Reformed about them? Well, they believe that later developments in the Mormon Church led the Mormon Church away from the original teachings of Joseph Smith, and that church became apostate. And so they are the ones who are truly preserving the legacy of Joseph Smith. So you have numerous groups that are like this, and as we move on into the 20th century and beyond, there's even more groups now that are just proliferating. But I don't know how many remember a guy named Warren Jeffs. Anybody ever heard of this guy? Colorado City, Colorado. Big controversy around this guy, and he fled from the United States because of embezzlement of people's money and all kinds of stuff, and ended up in Canada where he ended up being caught, and now he's doing time in prison. Well, Warren Jeffs was a leader in this RLDS group. They consider themselves part of the Reformed LDS that is supposedly headquartered here in Independence, Missouri. But he had taken a significant number of people and had moved out and had created a commune, essentially, in Colorado City, Colorado, which was, when they moved there, very, very tiny town. So very quickly you have an influx of 600 or 700 Mormons. They quickly took over the town. So they own the town, they own the city government, they own the sheriff's department, and so on for this town. But anyway, that's kind of a modern day story about the RLDS. Anyways, during this time in Missouri that Joseph Smith begins his work on his own inspired translation of the Bible. Now, many of you may not be aware of this, but the Mormons also have their own, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses before them, the Mormons have their own version of the Bible that they use almost exclusively. It's their own translation. They have been known to use other translations, but they greatly prefer Joseph Smith's translation. Now, Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, it doesn't, I can't honestly say, I've read behind a lot of guys who have kind of studied the history of this thing, and I can't honestly say that it really departs from, let's just put it this way, it's almost a word-for-word plagiarized copy of the King James Version. So I sincerely doubt if Joseph Smith actually translated it. He far more likely just transcribed the King James and altered a few words here and there, maybe to make things more understandable, but it's almost verbatim, the King James Version of the Bible. So it doesn't really, there's nothing in his version of the Bible that actually changes or challenges any significant biblical doctrines. Of course, they don't need to, since they're receiving ongoing further revelation that adds to and completely even overturns the teaching of the Bible. Anyway, so it's there they form the first presidency of the Latter-day Saints, and they claim authority over all church matters and church members. During this time, however, in Independence, a mob of locals gathered, grabbed Smith and several other of his elders, took them out into the center of town, and tarred and feathered them. Now you may say, now what's going on here? Well, there's a lot going on, okay? And it's an accumulation of things. If you read the Mormon version of it, they were just innocent missionaries just serving the Lord, and the local townspeople got upset with them, okay? But swirling around, and if you go and you really have to dig into the history of these towns. You have to go to Independence, Missouri, and read records from the city and from newspapers of the time. There were several things that happened that caused animosity against the Mormons. First thing that happened was the Mormons move into the area, and they start marrying up all the young girls. And they're marrying them into polygamous families. And naturally, the parents of these young girls are like, no way, you know. You're not having my daughter, and you're not swallowing up all the daughters of Independence, Missouri into a polygamous cult. So most of these people were deeply concerned about the fact that the girls were being seduced away from their homes by young Mormon boys who are making them all these promises of eternal life and plug in with us, and you'll be a queen in heaven, and you'll rule alongside your celestial husband, and all these kinds of things. So these girls are being deceived into following them. So there's a certain degree of animosity really starting to build there. Again, remember, frontier town, right? This is not a place where you can just kind of go and fade into the woodwork. Everything that you do is under the microscope, okay? Add to it the fact that around the fringe of the town, there was property that the Mormons had tried to obtain but other people had already staked a claim to the property. Now, this is, you have to understand, 1830s, way before we ever had a register of deeds, okay, where you went in and you bought a property and they did official documentation and they got a record on file, you know, that you bought this property. In those days, property was sold on a handshake and a promise, right? So there were people that had these properties around the edge of town, but as the Mormon group began to swell in numbers, turning the town of Independence from a town of about 125 people to a town of about 1,500 people in the space of about 3 years. So try to picture what that must look like, right? Okay? Basically, they're just being flooded with Mormons who are coming west, moving west, joining the church, coming out to join the Independence group. So there's a lot of land around the town, and there's a lot of land that has already been entered into basically bartered agreements with people. Well, what starts happening is there start being Indian raids on these properties, right? So the owners of these properties abandon the properties, and then the Mormons approach them, and they willingly sell them to the Mormons because the Mormons are willing to take the risk and live out there on the edge of town, right? So a rumor starts to circulate that it wasn't Indians that were attacking at all, that it was Mormon militia disguised as Indians attacking and terrorizing these settlers so they could run them off their land and take their land. Okay? Now, was that true or not? Wait and see. Okay? Just wait and see, because this story develops into something even more interesting later. So, anyway, as a result of these uprisings, eventually Missouri becomes embroiled in a battle between the Latter-day Saints and the people that they refer to as the Gentiles, which basically means any non-Mormons. It's during this time that Sidney Rigdon, one of the high muckamucks in the Mormon church, preaches a sermon, a very famous sermon called the Salt Sermon, okay? I don't know if you know anything about this story, but in the Old Testament there's a story of where the prophet of God gets a vision from the Lord, and he tells the fighting men of Israel, so it's go and sow the seeds of the Philistines with salt, right? Which means go and ruin their fields. Ruin it so they won't be able to grow any crops. Basically a way of conducting guerrilla warfare against the Philistines, right? But the whole goal being to drive them out, right? So Sidney Rigdon gets up and preaches a sermon from this passage and basically says it is their God-ordained duty to own all the land that their feet tread upon. So just like the Old Testament Israel, everywhere they go has been given to them by God. This is our new Zion, and we are to take this land, if necessary, even by force, okay? So what starts happening is violence starts breaking out between non-Mormons and Mormons. And pretty soon militia groups are formed up of both Mormons and non-Mormons, and they're literally shooting it out, okay, over territory. And it gets crazy. So finally, the governor of Missouri, again, y'all remember, 1840s, okay? This ain't America in the 20th century, okay? The governor of Missouri issues an extermination order. He calls upon national troops, federal troops, to move in and help them to drive the Mormons out, or if necessary, exterminate them. And he is overwhelmingly supported by all the non-Mormons in the area, okay? So he issues an order against them, and it looks like there are going to be troops, National Guard troops and federal troops, moving against these guys, right? So God comes in and saves the day. God gives Joseph Smith a revelation that this is not their New Jerusalem, that their new Zion must lay elsewhere. So we must move on, okay? So they move on from there, from Independence, Missouri, and they form a large group when they're moving this time. You can imagine how big a group this is. But at this point in time, they're approaching 2,000 in number, and more than that, really, of Mormon converts elsewhere, because Brigham Young and other missionaries are out converting people in other territories. So this is a very, very fast-growing religious movement. So they finally leave the county for other counties in the northern part of the state, but eventually trouble begins to break out there between them and the locals, and so they are pressed into moving even further out, which is during this time is when they move to a place called Nauvoo, Illinois. Okay? Nauvoo, Illinois, which again is a frontier town, very isolated place, surrounded by Indians. This is Wild West country for sure. And they move there, and the pattern begins to repeat itself. Okay? And again, pressure on the locals to give up their land. There's even talk about the fact that the Mormons want to buy the whole town out and basically just run all the locals out. And the locals that have been homesteading there for years are kind of averse to that idea. Okay? So begins to develop conflict again. But before it can really get out of hand like it did in Missouri. By the way, that is called in Missouri archives. You go look it up in their state history. It's called the Mormon Wars. That's what the Missouri state historians refer to it as. But before that conflict can really boil over in Illinois, a group of local people who are fired up about the Mormons' polygamy and all kinds of other strange practices that they find bizarre, they go and they raid the store of one of the Mormon elders who runs a general store. And in the back room of the store, they've supposedly found all kinds of Indian costumes where these militia groups have been dressing up as Indians and raiding, okay? So a lynch mob grabs Joseph Smith, and they're going to hang him in the street. And his militia comes to his defense, and they're ready to shoot it out with the locals. The sheriff steps in and says, wait, there's got to be a peaceful way to resolve this. Let's not bring this to bloodshed. So he takes Joseph Smith into protective custody, puts him in the local jail, just going to keep him there for a couple of days till the hotheads cool down, right? So that night, after everybody goes to bed, the mob comes back to the jail. They drag Joseph Smith over to a window, throw him out the window, and kill him. So is the end of the great Mormon prophet, Joseph Smith, right? Now, during this time, Brigham Young has been rising as a young leader in the Mormon church. In fact, let me read this to you. In the midst of translation, Crowder and Smith took to the woods to pray. During this time, this is for the Book of Doctrines and Covenants, they are visited by John the Baptist. None other than John the Baptist shows up to confer upon them the Aaronic priesthood. Now, right off the bat, let me ask you something. As a Christian, as an evangelical Christian, a Bible-believing Christian, what do you see as problematic with that? Anybody? We are forbidden, under penalty of death, to attempt any contact with the dead. And yet the Mormons throughout their history, this is only one example, okay? The Mormons throughout their history have frequent contact with the dead, with Old Testament saints who come back specifically to talk to them. We're told that practice is condemned under threat, under penalty of death from Yahweh, and yet the Mormons somehow have a special hotline where they're able to have these post-death conversations with various of the saints. But anyway, it's during this visit with John the Baptist that he confers the Aaronic priesthood upon them. This is a critically important crossroads event in the history of the church because John the Baptist tells the two young men that the Melchizedek priesthood will be restored through them, and that when it was restored, it will give them the power to lay hands on people for the gift of the Holy Ghost. And it will be in this sanctified company of people that have received their laying on of hands that essentially will become the rulers of the New Zion and will eventually take over the United States. Now, I know it's really hard for us to even imagine this or wrap your heads around this, or try to wrap your heads around how crazy this must have sounded to frontier farmers who were meeting up with this strange group of people that had just moved into their town, numbering in the thousands, and these guys are talking this kind of stuff, you know, and rumors are flying around about the fact they're going to take over the United States, you know, and they're like, wow, this is amazing, right? So there is this huge tension that develops with the Mormons. It seems like everywhere they go, they're wild, strange doctrine is getting them in deep trouble with locals, okay? So trouble begins to develop there, and of course, you know, culminating obviously in Joseph Smith's death at the hands of a mob. So his predecessors after him, the leaders who come in, of course, there's already a group of men that have this Aaronic priesthood who've been set aside for this special purpose. They get the revelation from God to move further west, that their Zion must not be here. Apparently, God has been mistaken now no less than 3 times because he has led them to a different Zion each time, right? So now finally they're going to move west. Only this time, wisely, they did not put a name on it. They just simply said, we're going west until God shows us, right? So they began to travel west, and young Brigham Young was among the people traveling west at this time, and more leaders in the church are beginning to confer. He was a school teacher for the Mormon children, and they saw him as a wise man, a man of articulate man, which he was, and they began to convey upon him more and more leadership responsibility. So anyway, they go west, and as they go west, they come to a place that, how can I describe this to you? It looks like the surface of the moon. Y'all ever been there? Anybody ever traveled to the Great Salt Lake? It is the most barren piece of land. You can look for miles and not see a tree, okay? And back in that day, in the 1800s, even more barren than it is today, okay? Because there was no city there, okay? So this is just this blasted-looking desert land. And the reason that it is because at one time, it was part of a great sea. And then when that sea receded, wonder how that happened. We won't even get into that, right? But when that sea receded, it left back behind a gigantic deposit of salt, which made it almost impossible for any kind of vegetation to grow in the area. So that's why you have this incredibly gigantic, huge, hundreds of miles across lake bed that is completely barren. And it's here that the angel of God appears to the remaining Mormon leadership and tells them, this is your Zion. You know, I don't know. If at that point, if I were a young Mormon following along with the group, I would have had to say, are you sure about this? You know, you sure God heard right? But of course, all kinds of biblical justification. You know, they're going back and preaching from Moses, and you know, this is going to be a land that flows with milk and honey, even though obviously the Middle East ain't exactly the land that flows with milk and honey, right? But God was going to bless them, and so therefore it would be a land. So they assured their people of the same thing. We're going to settle here, and God's blessing is going to be upon us, and our enterprise is going to grow, and it's going to take off. So, yay, they finally found a piece of territory that nobody wants. Exactly. Where they can settle and not have to worry about having any interface whatsoever with the Gentiles, and we're going to start building our place. And they literally built the city of Salt Lake City up from the ground in that barren desert. It's amazing. Truthfully, in the late 1800s, in the mid to late 1800s, this was a marvel of engineering. Because think about the fact that all the wood and everything that they used for construction, they had to go to the nearest mountains and mill it all and bring it back to Salt Lake City in order to build anything. No railroads to supply them. They built the railroad lines to connect up with the major east-west railroad systems in order to be able to supply Salt Lake City. They did it all themselves. The Mormons did it. It's an incredible feat of ingenuity. It really is. When you think about it, here's a pioneer people who just came basically with clothes on their back in wagons and horseback, and they came up there and they said, we're building right here. And they did. And they built an amazing monument to the ingenuity of these early settlers. If you go to Salt Lake City today, it's one of the most beautiful cities in America. It really is. It's a model city. It's clean. It's practically crime-free. It's an incredible place. No gambling, no drinking, no drugs, none of that stuff allowed there, right? You either get with the Mormon program or you are not going to be very welcome in Salt Lake City, okay? But nonetheless, look at it. It's a model city in many respects. It is, okay? So they built this thing from the ground up. So if you think they're done with their troubles with the Gentiles, you're wrong, okay? Because just a few years after they begin to settle there, Brigham Young is taking an increasingly prominent role in the church at that point. He is yet to be declared the prophet as the successor to Joseph Smith, but he's taking an increasingly powerful role in the church. But not long after they settle there, they create a city charter to establish the city of Salt Lake City, and they begin to build in earnest, and they receive a charter from the man who is for the United States. He's kind of like the territorial governor Don't think of it as a governor like we think of with having a Capitol building in Richmond and a governor. No, 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 no. This guy was the federal territorial governor for a whole region of areas out there that were not yet states. Okay, this is pre-Civil War, so this area is unsettled, untamed, doesn't even have statehood. But they enter into a charter with him, which is unique among the documents of our early government, in that it literally ceded this territory to the Mormon Church and to their control governmentally, okay, which is an amazing thing. I mean, it's just, you go back and you reread those documents and you think, wow, the people back east in Washington, they didn't know what they were dealing with, right? They just simply saw a group that says, we're willing to settle in this land and turn it into a rich and prosperous area, and they were like, sounds good to me. Okay, so basically they entered into this agreement with them. I won't go into all the incredible detail about how it was done. But then in 1847, something happens that will change both American history and Mormon history. A man named John Sutter is in a creek fishing, and he discovers gold flowing in that creek. And the gold is in copious amounts. At first, he doesn't even realize what it is. He sees this substance, but then he goes to a local establishment and has it checked out, and the guy tells him it's gold. And pretty soon, Sutter's, that's what it took the name, Sutter's Gold Rush is on in earnest, okay? So people start flooding west. There was already westward expansion taking place, the hardy pioneers out on the westward frontier. But now, all of a sudden, people back east who were looking for a piece of the American dream, they're like, wow, fortunes are being made. People are literally banking thousands and thousands of dollars in gold, right? We can go out there and make our fortunes. So the gold rush is on within just a matter of 2 or 3 years in earnest, okay? What that means is a flood of people coming into these formerly barren territories where the Mormons' only company in this region basically were the Indian tribes that have lived there for hundreds of years, okay? Now, all of a sudden, you've got tons of white people going west, right? So in one such incident, there's a wagon train of about 300 people traveling through the northern part of Mormon territory. And as they come into the area, they meet some trappers and some other guys, hunters, and they kind of tell them, stay away from the Mormons. You don't want to have anything to do with them. They're weird. Literally, this is how it goes down, right? So they're like, well, we'll give them a wide berth. So they go way to the north of the city of Salt Lake. Then they get hit by winter. And they have to settle in and wait because there's no way they're crossing the Rocky Mountains in the dead of winter. They've already heard too many stories about entire wagon trains that perished and died along the way. So they think, well, we'll just wait out the winter. We'll hunker down here. We'll wait out the winter in this northern part of what today is the northern part of the state of Utah, right? So they settle in this place called Mountain Meadows. Now, it is outside the Salt Lake area, and it actually is a rather lush, beautiful place that they settle in, but winter is coming in. So they settle in there. Well, rumors about this get back to Salt Lake, and the rumors coming back to Salt Lake is the Gentiles have established a colony in our territory, okay? So true to their old form, a guy named Henry Lee Jackson leads a group of 2 Mormon militia dressed as Indians out, and they kill the entire wagon train, okay? So the President of the United States at that time is Martin Van Buren. And so when he hears about that, he sends the cavalry. And he says, you're going to go out, and he tells one of his generals, he said, you're going to investigate this. And he said, and if necessary, you execute every leader of the Mormon church. We're going to put this thing down before it even begins. Okay? So now you got the federal troops coming. Okay? Before they can arrive, Brigham Young receives a revelation. God has told us to live at peace with the Gentiles. So now we're going to welcome Gentiles in. Otherwise, how are we ever going to reach the Gentiles with our superior message about the kingdom of God if we don't allow the Gentiles to come on in? And that is not the first, nor will it be the last time that Mormon leadership receives new revelation that supersedes old revelation. See? Now that's what's weird about the whole Mormon situation. It'd be different if they were continuing to receive ongoing revelation, and it was simply adding to the revelation already given, right? That's not what's happening, okay? What's happening is they're receiving revelation that contradicts previous revelation, that contradicts Joseph Smith, it contradicts Sidney Rigdon, it contradicts other prophets of the Mormon Church, and changes what they have said, radically altering what they have said. So, in other words, what they're saying essentially is God changed his mind, right? God said this, but then a few years later, when circumstances start going in a negative direction, God changed his mind, said, change up, time for a new plan, right? Because formerly, you're going to inherit the earth, you're going to own the country, you're sooner or later going to own the world, you're going to be the rulers. You know, Joseph Smith is going to be president. Oh, well, he's dead now, so now it'll be Brigham Young, right? And you will own America, and from there you will spread, and you will own the nations of the earth. The nations are your inheritance, right? So they're taking this quite literally. But unfortunately, when things start to turn against them, then all of a sudden there's been a slight alteration in plans, okay? Now, I owe almost everything I know about this period of time to a great book that I'm going to recommend to you if you're interested in reading more in depth. Now, most people go, I've got enough of it from you, Pastor Don. But if you're at all interested, this book is still in print. And it's a book called One Nation Under Gods. Not One Nation Under God, but One Nation Under Gods. And it's written by a guy named Richard Abanes, Abanes. And Richard was a missionary in Utah to the Mormons for many, many, many years as a pastor. He was a Calvary Chapel pastor. He planted a Calvary Chapel in Utah, and not in Salt Lake City, but in another Mormon enclave there. And he spent many, many years ministering to Mormons, sharing the gospel with Mormons, seeing many people converted and coming into his church that were ex-Mormons. So he had in-depth conversations with them, knowledge about it. But primarily, this is based on his research this book is based on his research of their primary sources. So he dug and did his due diligence and went to the library in Salt Lake City where all of the original documents of the Mormon elders are still archived. And he read all this material and really familiarized himself with the early history of the Mormon Church and wrote this fantastic book that probably does a far better job than I can do in a 35-minute synopsis of the history of Mormonism, okay? But needless to say, as I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, Mormonism, it trying to come to grips with Mormonism as a movement is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall, okay? Because it has changed and shifted so much over time. In fact, another book that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is The Maze of Mormonism, right? And the whole premise of that author is the more you dig into Mormonism, the more you find out that it's like a shifting shadow. It's changed over and over and over down through the years so much that it's hard to nail down what Mormons actually do believe. I'll give you a great example of that, okay? I mentioned it last week in passing at the end, but it's worth going back and touching on it, okay? Joseph Smith once preached, and his other fellow elders who were members of the original Aaronic priesthood preached very strongly, because we have sermons on record of them preaching this, that people of dark skin, non-whites, not just blacks, but Hispanics, whatever, people of dark skin were the serpent's seed, okay? They go to Genesis chapter 6, where the angels commingled with the daughters of men, okay? And, of course, I believe that to be a literal story, okay? I take that seriously. But according to their version of that story, the offspring that they produce, the Nephilim, right, were the mark of them was that they were dark-skinned, okay? According to that early Mormon doctrine, dark-skinned people were irredeemable. They were the serpent's seed. They were children of the devil and could not be saved, okay? While they were in Nauvoo, Illinois, just prior to Joseph Smith being martyred, they call it his martyrdom, by the way. Prior to Joseph Smith being martyred, that doctrine changed. And so they rejected the concept of the serpent seed, but they still taught that people of dark skin were lesser than people of white skin. Okay, a definite hierarchy. Okay, people of dark skin could never ascend to become gods. They could live on the redeemed new earth that would be created by Mormons in the future, but they would never be able to ascend. They would never be able to have temple marriage and reach godhood, reach the status of godhood. Okay, and it wasn't until 1978 that doctrine finally changed. Okay, a little late. Civil rights movement had been 10 years before, but at least they caught up with the times, and God once again changed his mind, right? And now it's okay to have, black folks enter into the priesthood, rise to the level of exaltation, and so on, have temple marriage, etc. So that's just one kind of salient example of the way that Mormonism has shifted. And their response to that, when you talk to a Mormon and you bring these kind of things up, is to say, well, of course, Revelation is ongoing. Yes, okay, but Revelation should not be contradictory, right? Right? Revelation may be ongoing. God may still be unfolding his plan progressively to his people, but his plan won't contradict what he has previously said. It will always be in harmony with what has already been said. God doesn't alter. God doesn't change, right? So this is another one of those kind of warning bells that should go off whenever we talk about Mormon history. Now, down through the years, Mormons have changed a great deal, okay? So it would be unfair to characterize the modern-day LDS Church in Salt Lake City as being the same or identical with what we've talked about over the last several weeks. That would be wrong, because they have changed quite dramatically, okay? But what's important for you to understand is this. Even though they've changed, well, for example, another great example is plural marriage. On paper, the official church in Salt Lake City now condemns polygamy, plural marriage. That's on paper, okay? But in reality, plural marriage is still widely practiced in the Mormon church. Yes, even among people who are members of the main church out of Salt Lake City, okay? So it's a practice that still carries on, even though it is officially being frowned upon. Now, these changes in doctrine are one of the reasons why there have been so many fragmentations of the Mormon church. There have been so many groups that spun out of the church because they believed that by going back and changing the original teaching of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, that group was apostatizing. They were turning away from truth that had been already revealed by God. So these groups maintain that they are the consistent Mormons that are still keeping the original teachings of the Mormon church as handed down by their original 12 apostles, okay? And that they're remaining faithful to it. And that the LDS church in Salt Lake City is, at best, compromised, at worst, completely apostate. Now, let me give you yet another example, okay, of shifting trends within the Mormon church. For years, and I mean, I can't even begin to tell you, but going back to the very earliest stages of the pro-life movement, the LDS Church in Salt Lake City, I can't speak for all the sects, but for Salt Lake City, was one of the staunchest allies that the pro-life movement had. Nobody was stronger. Outside the Catholic Church, there was no single body of Christian faith in America that more staunchly opposed abortion. But that, too, has started to shift in recent years. This is why you can see a guy like Mitt Romney come along, and he waffles all over the place on abortion, even though he is a temple-baptized Mormon who is capable of achieving ascendance to godhood, okay? And yet he has flip-flopped numerous times on the issue of abortion because the church itself is going through transition on the issue of abortion. And today, right now, as we speak, the same transition is taking place with regard to sexuality. Again, the Mormons have always been defenders of traditional sexual relationships, male-female marriage, so on and so forth, even though, the polygamy thing is a bit weird, right? But in terms of the actual sexual relations between, it was man and woman, that was the way God designed it. And now they're actually beginning to, you're hearing Mormon voices that are pro-LGBTQ, and so on. So again, the church is checking the wind and, kind of changing as the times change. And no doubt at some point down the road, sooner or later, one of their apostles or prophets, and they still have 12 apostles who are leaders of the church in Salt Lake City. One of them will receive I think all of them right now are very, very old. Last time I looked, they were up in their 80s and even older. But sooner or later, some new, younger generation of prophets is going to come along, and they're going to receive a revelation from the Lord that LGBTQ is cool with God, So this is why when we talk about Mormonism, we're talking about a maze where really things have changed so much and so many times through the years that it's almost really impossible to keep track. It really is. I have some very close friends that lived for years in Salt Lake City, and they worked closely with the Utah Gospel Lighthouse, which is a ministry to Mormons that was founded by Gerald and Sandra Tanner. They wrote, probably from a Christian perspective, the most voluminous book that is. I can't even recommend it to Christians because it's so thick. It's like an encyclopedia. It's a dictionary. It's like huge. But they wrote probably the definitive book from a Christian perspective on Mormonism, called Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. And even though the book now is out of print, if you're ever interested in reading the magnum opus of Christian research on Mormons, outside of that book, which is much smaller, by the way, and easier to read, One Nation Under Gods, I recommend that book, Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, because it is overwhelming in its historical detail about the Mormon church. And their ministry has been parked right across the street from the Deseret bookstore, right off the campus of Brigham Young, for 30, 40 years. Gerald has passed away now. Sandra's still alive, but their ministry carries on through younger people that they have mentored that continue the ministry there. But we had friends in North Carolina that had worked with them for years, and the stories they could tell you is amazing. But they went out faithfully, witnessed on the streets. Fortunately, the law in Salt Lake City changed back in the 70s and 80s to allow outside groups to come in and proselytize. It used to be against the law. If you tried to proselytize a Mormon in Salt Lake City, you'd be arrested and put in jail. That has changed, thankfully. So now they can engage them in dialogue on the streets and talk with them about the Lord. And so there are several fruitful ministries out there that have been trying to plow that ground, minister to Mormons for years, and they see some victories. So people come to Jesus. So it's an exciting thing to be involved with. But anyway, that's where I got a good bit of the information that I have on them. Okay, so that will kind of be a wrap on the Mormon Church. We had to take several weeks because I felt like it's really a complicated history that deserved more than just kind of an overview of their doctrine. I mean, once you understand their teaching, you understand Jehovah's Witnesses, okay? They don't have this complicated backstory, okay? But to truly understand Mormonism, you have to understand this backstory. The history is as important a piece of it as anything else. So I just want to take this moment to go ahead and open the floor for any questions anybody might have about this.